Hi friends, this is Angelica. Thanks for joining me here on the Greetery YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be introducing to you two new products in the new Calico Fields collection, which is going to be available in the Greetery shop this Thursday, September 8th. And then we're going to put together 3 cards. So let's take a quick look at the first product that we're going to use. This is the new BotaniCuts apple die. It comes with an assembly guide and dies to die cut 3 different size apples, and then there's matching stems and leaves and a branch included in this set. So I've already die cut a panel of white heavyweight cardstock, and I'm going to be using Distress Oxide inks to color the paper. So I'm starting with my lightest colors first. I picked Spun Sugar for the apple blossoms and Antique Linen for the apple slice. Moving on to the red apples, I started with Crushed Olive Distress Oxide ink, making sure to ink the top where the stems will be, and then I added quick drops of color around the apples to layer the red ink on top of, and this is going to help give different tones of red to the apples. Now I'm moving on to my lightest color, which is Tattered Rose, and this is going to be where I want the highlight of the apple to be. I'm going to color the apples starting with the lightest color and then working my way to the darkest color and then blending that back out to the lightest color. So the middle color that I had picked was Festive Berries, and then I used Aged Mahogany for the darkest color. I'm trying to use a pretty light hand when I'm adding the ink to the paper because I am rubbing the paper a lot with a sponge. If the paper gets too wet, it will pill. So I'm taking my time and I'm going back and forth making sure that I can get that ink moved without oversaturating the paper. I'm pretty much done with the red apples. Now we're going to move on to a green apple. The colors that I picked are Twisted Citron, Forest Moss, and Rustic Wilderness. I'm going to ink this apple pretty much the same as the red apples, starting with my lightest color and then working to the darkest color, blending that back out to the lightest color. Now I added spots of Forest Moss to layer the other greens on top of for different tones. Rustic Wilderness is a pretty bold green ink, so I kept that color on the right edge of the apple, and it just blended out so beautifully with the Forest Moss and the Twisted Citron. I was really happy on how these 3 colors work together, especially for a green apple. It came together perfectly. I'm finishing up the green apple, just doing my last final touches before I move on to the leaves. I'm going to leave the same green inks out for the leaves and colored them the same. I did leave the outside tips of the leaves the lightest color. And now it's time for the branch and the stems for the apple. Now I'm just using ground espresso ink, and the stems are pretty small. I am working on my favorite silicone mat, so it has a nice grip for the papers, but I still, brought out my tweezers for a little help. I'm going to finish the die cuts by adding splatter to them. So I put Black Soot Distress ink and ground espresso on my mat and then added a drop of water. And I'm going to use a paintbrush to splatter all over the apples and the rest of the die cuts. Now I did make sure that I didn't put too much splatter on the die cuts because I do like to over splatter, so I had to use a lot of restraint here and know when to stop. To put the apples together, I pulled out the assembly guide to help me make sure that I had the branch put together and the leaves glued in the right places. I was very careful with the glue. I did not want to activate this ink in any sort of way. I was just really careful. I tapped whatever piece I put the glue onto my mat first, and then attached it like what I just did with the stem, attached it to the apple as carefully as I could, not to let any of that glue squeeze out. Now we're going to move on to the second product, the second new product, which is the Bushel basket die. I did die cut a panel of white heavyweight cardstock again with the dies, and now I've picked 3 brown inks to color the basket with. I did keep the whole inking process in this video sped up, but it does take me a couple minutes to put the basket together. Now the 3 inks that I used were brushed corduroy, vintage photo, and ground espresso. The brushed corduroy and vintage photo I used mostly on the front part of the basket. I do want the inside of the basket to be the darker part. So the ground espresso is going to be mainly for the inside basket. I'm going to be checking a lot throughout this inking, putting the top part of the basket on top of the inner basket just to make sure that I am keeping the inside darker than the outside. When I die cut these pieces, I did die cut them with a shim because the dies have an indent inside them to make the basket look like it's made out of wood. So there is a wood grain in them. And with the shim, it really helped bring that embossing out. So if you die cut your paper and the wood grain doesn't really show, go ahead and if you have a shim or your personal shim, re-die cut the paper with the shim, and the embossing should turn out really nice. I'm finishing up with the basket now, and I'm going to move on to the bands, and I'm just adding a single coat of ground espresso to them. Just doing 1 coat. I'm not doing anything special with these bands. They're just going to help bring that dark color to the basket. Putting the basket together is super easy. I just added some glue to the top and bottom of the outside basket, attached it to the inner basket, and then I'm going to glue on the bands. Again, I'm just making sure that my glue control is very light so it doesn't seep out and activate the ink. The last 2 items that we need to do before finishing up the basket is the handles, and there is a label or a tag that goes on the front of the basket. I'm not really sure what it's called, but I did ink up the handles with black soot distressed ink. And then for the label, I'm going to use a sentiment from the Market Baskets stamp set to stamp a greeting on the label for the basket. I'll slide that sentiment into place and then glue it to the back of the label, and now I'm going to attach that to the basket, and we are now finished with the basket, and it's time to fill it. So you can see I did a few more apples off screen to make sure I had enough for the basket, all different sizes, and I'm picking different colors and the 2 smaller sizes for the basket. I did glue some leaves onto a couple of the apples. Once I have my apple arrangement put together, I am going to use a little bit of glue to keep them all in place. I have my tweezers in my hand to help me gently pull out a couple of apples just to make sure that the arrangement is in perfect placement before I add the glue. Now the basket does have a back bar, which is what I tucked the apples into. So I glued that back row together to the back bar, and now I'm just pulling the apples apart a little bit and dropping some glue in between the front apples. Now it's time to put the cards together, and I'm going to start by making 2 backgrounds doing some ink smushing. I did put some Distress Oxide ink onto my mat, tumbled glass for this first panel. I'm just making sure that I'm keeping the ink towards the top of the panel, and I'm trying to use a really light hand. I don't want it too dark. The second panel, I'm actually using acetate to put the ink onto the panel for me because I just wanted this to be a really organic paint splatter look. And I brought in peacock feathers just to add a little bit more of a darker blue to that background. I just added a couple drops of that. I die cut both panels with the large crimped frame die, and now I'm going to add a sentiment to this first panel using stamps from Blessed Bloom stamp set. I stamped Blessed first, and then I added the second part of the sentiment using my Misty L-shaped ruler to make sure I had the stamp straight and even under the word Blessed. Once I finished stamping the sentiment, I attached the panel to a card base, and now I'm using thin foam squares to add the apple branch to the card, and that's going to finish this first card. For the second card, I am again using thin foam squares to add the basket to the other ink smushed panel, and to finish this card, I am adding one more apple and an apple slice at the bottom of the barrel, just to have a little bit more interest to the card front. And for my last card, I just kept it very clean and simple. I added the 4 large apples that I'd made, and I stamped a sentiment right in the middle from the Sentiment Suite Thank You stamp set. And that's going to finish all of today's cards. You can find more details on these products over on the Greetery blog, as well as the rest of the products in the new release. I want to thank you so much for joining me, and I want to thank the Greetery for letting me introduce these products to you. If you liked what you saw, please give this video a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more projects from the Greetery, be sure to subscribe before you leave. Thanks again for joining me. Take care, friends.